I would like to dedicate this year to Ilui Nishmat, the casualties. In particular, I have on my mind weighs heavily Omer Tabibi, who was an Israeli soldier who was hit by an anti-tank missile a few hours ago. 21 years of age, a month before being discharged from the military, and in general, it's obviously it's a very tough time, I think, here and for Jews everywhere. But if there's one right thing we can do aside from tefillah and reaching out to each other, and I do encourage you, by the way, if you have friends or family in Israel, it really is appreciated if you just send a little message and say, hi, how are you doing? How can I be supportive, or I'm thinking of you? That does matter. But if there's anything else we should be doing aside from sending support and tefillah, it's learning Torah. So let's do it, and let's dedicate it to everything that matters. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and to refocus. It's everything going on in the world, but to focus in on our little Dalet Amud of halachot here, our halachic territory, and see what we can do with it. So far, we've done a lot so far, and tonight's sort of the culmination of this series. In the first section of this series, we really talked about the nature of the mitzvah of Keri'at Ha-Torah, and we talked about the fact that anyone who's present for Keri'at Ha-Torah can fulfill the mitzvah of Keri'at Ha-Torah through active listening and engagement in the reading. We also talked about the nature of the aliyah, that originally it wasn't an aliyah, it was originally a reading. Really only the first reader and the last reader were reciting brachot, and in the middle there weren't brachot. That shifted over time, and at some point those roles also became distinct, so that the person reading wasn't necessarily the one reciting the brachot, though it's really lechatchila, ideally from the outset, the person being called for an aliyah is supposed to be reading at least quietly along with the Baal Koreh. And talking about all of those things, we talked about, someone's got their thing not muted. I encourage you to mute your microphones. Thank you so much. And we talked about how that winds up relating to women, that even if there's a theoretical permission for women to read from the Torah, would that be for all of the aliyot or for part of the aliyot? And would that include the brachot or not? And we saw that there's potential room to talk about 3 or possibly 4 of the aliyot on Shabbat with the brachot, except that, and this is what we were looking at last week, the Braita quoted in the Talmud says that aval amru chachamim isha lo tikra mipnei kvod hatzibur, the woman shouldn't read from the Torah because of Kvod HaTzibur. What we did last week was we started defining what Kvod HaTzibur is. And we looked at, thank you, the link is now up in the chat for anyone who wants the link to the sources. We'll start sharing screen soon. Last week, we started talking about what Kvod HaTzibur is. We saw different examples in the Talmud for what Kvod HaTzibur would be. Some of them seemed not so relevant to our cases. There were things like just putting a burden on the congregation, like rolling the Torah scroll in front of the congregation as opposed to setting it up in advance. And others sounded like they might be more relevant. For example, we saw a discussion about Kvod HaTzibur being an issue if a shul doesn't have a complete Torah scroll, but instead has chumashim, incomplete scrolls, and that the Keri'at Torah is not supposed to take place from those scrolls because of Kvod HaTzibur, and different rationales given for why that would be. The main ones being that it would either show that the people in the community will reflect poorly upon them for not taking the trouble to acquire a proper scroll, for not prioritizing that, or that perhaps it would foster laxity among the members of the community in acquiring the scroll they're supposed to have. If you say that you don't need to get the full scroll, maybe it's going to encourage the community not to measure up to what we think the communal standards or the standards of the tzibur should be. And the second rationale we looked at had to do, it was kind of a funny case about if a minor could read from the Torah in rags, where that it's not technically a case of erva, it's called the case of Kvod HaTzibur. There's something going on there, though, in the continuum of tzniut, or about what's appropriate representation for the community. And each of those 2 explanations for Kvod HaTzibur actually might line up with some of the main explanations for Kvod Tzibor that have been offered in the context of the discussion of women and aliyot. That it might be that, along the lines of what we said with Chumashim, it might be that the perception would be that a woman, or that the statement, the stipulation by Chazal would be that a woman reading the Torah for the congregation, when the woman is not obligated in minyan and thus is not obligated to ensure that there's a minyan for Kriyat Torah. She's not obligated to be at the Torah reading, though she can fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyat Torah by being present to hear the Torah reading. That having her read for the community might either reflect poorly on the men of the community who are obligated in the formal mitzvah of Talmud Torah for not having prepared themselves to be able to read, or it might foster a sort of laxity with their obligations. It might encourage the men of the community not to measure up, not to make the extra effort to learn Kriyat Torah, and to rely on the women instead, which is not considered an ideal, again, because the women aren't obligated in forming the minyan. They don't create the minyan, and the women don't have the formal obligation in Talmud Torah. That's one way to explain it. A second group of explanations, and that we saw was actually attested. We looked closely in particular at the Ritva. It's also in Rav Avram Minahar. That's attested somewhat in Rishonim, though we kind of spelled it out more clearly, along the lines in particular of how Mariva Rabiba Zatzal, Rav Yehuda Henkin explained it. A second possibility for Kvod Tzibor with respect to women is the whole world of tznius issues. Rav Yaakov Emden is probably the first to talk about this explicitly. He talks about we have separation in the shul, and a woman reading from the Torah is somehow going to impinge on that separation. Others have brought up things ranging from Kol Isha or Rav Hershel Schachter suggesting that anyone taking on a public role is somehow compromising on tzniut, and having women do it within a ritual context is a stronger type of compromise that perhaps, back to the language of the Chumashim, that perhaps fosters laxity on the part of the congregation or reflects poorly upon the men of the congregation. And there is this question, there is this sense that it does, and this is something that I think the partnership minyanim have navigated in different ways. There's a sense in which it does shift the norms of how gender separation or gender roles work in the shul. And in the case of partnership minyanim, I think consciously and deliberately so. But there's a school of halachic voices, in particular later authorities, who've raised that as being the concern, to the point where some have even suggested that that's really what Kvod Tzibor meant here. It was sort of a euphemism for that kind of world of concern. So you have two different ways of looking at it. The first one is really the one that's more well attested in the earlier sources, and that jibes a little better with the other discussions of Kvod Tzibor that we see. It's still not decisive. Okay, and this is one of the things that makes this discussion so difficult, is that when you can't 100% clearly define exactly what the issue is, it's a little harder to know what the ways to address the issue might be, if there is a way to do it. Okay, so now what I want to do now is I want to go back into the sources and talk through what, if any, openings or possibilities there might be, could there be for a woman to read from the Torah once the statement has been made in the Braita that a woman shouldn't do it. Is there anything else to talk about, and what would that be? So let's try sharing the screen. Okay, and it worked. Okay, the first source I want to look at here is actually, it's an English translation. It's a like official English translation, or it's from an article. Again, my Rebbe Rav Henkin Zatzal, and Rav Henkin wanted to suggest something really interesting. His grandfather, the renowned posek Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, said that really didn't think that the person receiving the Aliyah was considered to be a reader of the Torah, and as such, my Rav Henkin, or the more recent Rav Henkin, the younger Rav Henkin, suggested that maybe that would affect, the fact that we have the Baal Koreh would affect this whole discussion to start with. Meaning, when you're talking about someone reading from the Torah, perhaps it's one thing. Perhaps when the Baal Koreh is no longer the Olela Torah, maybe that changes the whole calculus of Kvod Tzibor. Does it mean the same thing? Does it reflect the same way on the congregation for a woman to be reading from the Torah, or to be called up from the Torah, if to start with, it's not that everyone from the congregation is reading, but it's generally speaking, a defined person. So I'll just read you what he said. And what's interesting is that in this particular article, he explains why that's an idea that he floated, but it's not one that he has total confidence in. My grandfather, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkinzal, wrote that today's custom of the Baal Korah reading all the Aliyot is in effect only one person reading the entire portion. I added that according to this, considerations of Kvod HaTzibur are put in abeyance as well. The Braita stipulates that a woman should not read in the Torah, while today the Baal Kriya reads, and not the woman herself. In the time of the Talmud, being called up to the Torah always involved reading from it, and the phrase to read in the Torah was interchangeable with receiving an aliyah. Therefore, the conclusion I drew from the language of the Braita is that if reading is not involved, there wouldn't be an issue of Kvod Tzibur. But this, although highly plausible, is not in itself proven. Conceivably, other factors might be involved. And while starting from sometime during the period of Rishonim, when use of a Baal Kriya became widespread, a distinction could have been made between a woman's reading the Torah and having an aliyah. This is nowhere spelled out. Apparently, this distinction was suggested only recently when women's Torah readings became an issue. So what Rav Henkin is saying is, well, this idea is really intriguing. The idea that the whole calculus of what Kvod HaTzibur means, again, this doesn't work for the Tznius perspective, but from the perspective that Kvod HaTzibur has to do with the congregations, the men of the congregation's relationship to reading the Torah, how it reflects upon them, or what the standard they're supposed to meet as a congregation. It's my husband. Hi. So according to that perspective, perhaps the existence of the Baal Korah could change the calculus. It's an interesting idea. And then Rav Henkin says, but it's an idea. It's not something I can prove. And not only can I not prove it, we've got a long experience at this point of having a Baal Korah, and we haven't seen halachic discussions say, oh, now we have a Baal Korah, now the whole situation of Kvod HaTzibur has dropped to the wayside. So it's this idea that he brings, but it's not an idea that he was willing to say that he was confident was true. I think in general, this is actually important. It's going to come up in a couple of ways. Rav Henkin was really a pioneer of discussing these issues, of kind of playing with, is there a way that within the context of halacha, a woman could in practice receive an aliyah or read from the Torah? The way I experienced it, this was actually one of the last things we discussed before he died, but the way I saw it was he was interested in seeing if this could work. He made different suggestions. He raised possibilities. I think he was really hoping that this was going to be a serious discussion in the Beit Midrash. I don't think that he anticipated that this was sort of going to take wings and become something that was going on practically before it was more hashed out among halachic authorities. So sort of what sort of happened in terms of partnership minyanim is a lot of ideas that Rav Henkin floated as theoretically possible, like this one, were picked up by Rabbi Mendel Shapiro in a paper that he wrote in advance of his daughter's bat mitzvah. And that actually wound up being, and this is before Rav Sperber came on the scene and really before a lot of things happened, that wound up being the trigger that got the whole movement started. And I think it was really surprising to Rav Henkin, not because he necessarily thought that this would be impossible. He was interested in discussing it because he thought maybe there could be possibilities, but just because the discussion that he was hoping for among halachic luminaries to hash this out sort of got short-circuited in a sense, and it moved very quickly to practice. And I think that was surprising to him. And he had, and we'll talk about it, he had different reactions to it, which were not, which were measured and careful. But I think that wasn't what he had anticipated when he kind of wrote these tshuvas. Okay, there's something else that comes up, and we talked about it last time, and Rabbi Jay actually mentioned it toward the end of our last shir as well, which is, well, what about this kind of intuitive sense that, well, things have changed, and what we think of as being covetic now is not what people thought of as being covetic then. So is that something that changes the relevance or the calculus of Kvod HaTzibur? Here what comes into play is a psak by the Rambam, a classic psak, where he talks about, what if we have a gezerah, a rabbinic prohibition, or a takana, a rabbinic level enactment, and the Beit Din makes them. V'inhigu minhag upashat hadavar b'chol Yisrael, and this became customary, and this spread in all of Israel. Okay, v'amad achreihem Beit Din acher, and another Beit Din comes, bikesh levatel dvarim harishonim la'kor ota takana v'ota gzera v'ota minhag, and they want to change it. Afilu betelatam shebigalo gazru harishonim o itkinu. So this is a classic law. It's discussed in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, but the Rambam clearly paskins, even if what we call batal hata'am, even if the rationale, the express rationale behind the rabbinic enactment has gone away, that does not necessarily mean batal gzera, that the enactment itself or the rabbinic prohibition itself has disappeared. So there's a tricky thing here, which is even if we were, and actually what we saw is that the discussion in rabbinic literature, halachic literature about kavod tzibor is not about an intuitive sense of kavod. But even if we were to say that that was what is at issue, it's not so simple to just say this isn't relevant anymore. And this is one of the areas in which Rav Daniel Sperber has spoken out strongly. So Rav Sperber, makes this argument about change. Says, when all is said and done, a woman can be the state comptroller in Israel, shofetet b'beit mishpat elyon, Supreme Court judge, sar b'memshala, or government minister, afilu rosh memshala, even the prime minister. Ve'en anu ki yechidim u'tzibur chashim elbon mikach. And no one feels insulted by this. Ulai be'emet im kein musag ze no takef b'tzibur she'yomenu. Maybe if so, this idea of kavod tzibur should no longer be relevant today. But then he says something really interesting, which is, unless we see it as a full-out prohibition, and the context here, I couldn't bring the whole discussion. The context is that basically Rav Sperber says that, look, if it's clear, if it really is clearly an isur, when Chazal say, when Chazal say that a woman should not read from the Torah because of kavod tzibor, Rav Sperber says, if this really is a full-out halacha, then we're stuck. And the reason he gives for being stuck is the Rambam. Now, Rav Sperber wants to argue that this is not a full-out halacha, which is tricky to say, because it's not how it really has been treated classically in halachic literature. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Rav Jeremy Reeder, who is a Rosh Yeshiva, current Rosh Yeshiva at YU, wrote an extensive kind of response to partnership minyanim. He published a short version, and then he published a longer version on his blog. And he basically says that even though and he's drawing on the Rambam, and he says, even though rabbinic enactments may reflect or have been impelled by concerns no longer in evidence, those enactments remain halachically binding, absent communal custom to the contrary. Evidence of Talmudic case law that the prohibition applied only when the animating concerns of the enactment were present, or if the formulation of the prohibition itself implies limitation. None of those conditions is present in the case of enactment against aliyot for women. Irrespective of how we might interpret the concern of kavod tzibor, or how we might assess its contemporary relevance, according to traditional principles of halachic decision-making, the rabbinic prohibition against calling women to the Torah remains in force. Okay, so Rav Reeder comes out pretty strongly against Rav Sperber's argument, and the bottom line of what's going on in terms of how they're disagreeing, they both accept that they both basically accept the Rambam Psak. In one place, Rav Sperber questions the Rambam Psak and long lines of arrival. They both really accept the Rambam Psak. The disagreement is Rav Reeder is reading the original Breita in the way it's traditionally been read, which is it's a hard and fast halacha. And Rav Sperber is saying, well, if we don't think it's a hard and fast halacha, then maybe there's room not to apply the Rambam here. Okay. How else could we question or look at the relevance of kavod tzibor? There's another thing that comes up, which is, well, what about if we're outside of the shul setting? Is kavod tzibor different inside the shul and outside of the shul? So we see this in Sefer Habatim, an early Spanish Rishon. Yesh min agdolim shekatav shamipalalin bebatehem b'asara isha korah sham b'torah. He says that there is some luminary, he doesn't say who it is, we don't know who wrote, that when people daven in their homes with minyan, isha korah sham b'torah, that a woman can read from the Torah. Shaloni krat tzibur elek shemipalalim b'beit knesset. It's not really a proper tzibur unless they're davening in shul. Now, if this were accepted l'halacha, this would be a very big deal, right? Because this would mean that in a synagogue, you couldn't have a woman reading from the Torah. But if someone wanted to make a private minyan in their own home, perhaps you could. What's tricky here, though, is again, this kind of flies in the face of normative halacha. So, for example, the Torah talks about kol yud mikrit tzibor l'chol davar. Anytime you have a minyan, it's considered to be a tzibor. Conceptually, what's the question? Is the tzibor defined by the presence of a minyan, or is there a certain level of tziboriyut, which is also of publicity, of being the representative of the community? Is there another level that is achieved in, let's say, a formal synagogue context? Generally speaking, Sefer Batim's suggestion is not widely accepted. There's another angle that you could come at to say that maybe the home is different from the shul. And this we actually find in a really interesting ruling from Rav Yaakov Emden. Hold on, I'm going to expand the zone here so you can see this. This is really fascinating. Okay, so a yoledet after childbirth is supposed to bring korban. She's supposed to bring a sacrifice. And nowadays, she, of course, can't bring a sacrifice. Rav Yaakov Emden considered a husband going up to the Torah after his wife's childbirth as being sort of the modern day expression of the obligation to bring a sacrifice after childbirth, which is already really, really interesting. And then he says as follows. He says, well, what if for whatever reason the husband can't do it? What if the husband can't actually go up to the Torah and shul? All right, so stick with me. I'm going to read this inside now. The woman who's given birth goes to shul, first time after childbirth. Her husband is obligated to go up to the Torah. This obligation was done in commemoration of the obligation of the yoledet in a korban, and we are particular about it. Let's say that you have a small minyan in the house of the yoledet, and her husband isn't there, can't go up. In that case, we should say that the woman herself should read from the Torah. Even though we have this idea of kvod tzibor, so that women shouldn't be reading from the Torah, perhaps they didn't say it except in a big congregation or doing it all the time. But in this case, which is an uncommon occurrence, and in order to make it, to fix things up for her, and an enactment for her, because she has this obligation really to bring a korban, which has become her husband's aliyah, and he can't do it. You could say that in that case, they never made their decree. And he considers this case to be like a case of b'diavad. We'll come back to that, a case of after the fact, not ideal behavior, but what you do when you're put in a situation and you don't have another choice. So leans my thinking if my colleagues will agree with me. So first of all, so leans my thinking if my colleagues will agree with me is really important, because when you see a line like that, the suggestion is this is not a practical ruling. Back to the idea of, the Beit Midrash and floating an idea to be hashed out, right? So Rav Yaakov Emden here is basically saying, this is my concept, and it's got to be hashed out. It's got to achieve some kind of consensus. Other people have to agree with me before it could go anywhere. What's interesting is, those of you who were here with us in our last shir might remember that Rav Yaakov Emden was the one who suggested that the issue of kvod tzibor is that it interferes with the separation of men and women in shul. It might be that really what Rav Yaakov Emden means is the distinction between the big shul and the house minyan is that the standards of tzniut are a little bit more relaxed there. And by the way, that's something that's discussed, right? So there are certain contexts in which the rules for mechitza are different. If there's a different level of obligation in mechitza, even for tefillah, if we're talking about a fixed place for prayer and a sort of ad hoc minyan in a home. So it really may well be that it makes sense that these ideas of Rav Yaakov Emden jibe together. There are a couple of other poskim. Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul was a very important 20th century Sephardi posek in Israel, suggested the idea that maybe in a house, maybe when it's a family minyan, there could be some room for flexibility. Rav Ovadia Yosef shot him down 100%. Rav Henkin played with this idea as well, and considered it, though he didn't think that it could be done on its own. He suggested this in conjunction with waiving Kvod HaTzibur, which is something we're going to talk about in a minute. He suggested that a woman is prohibited from reading the Torah because of Kvod HaTzibur, which could be waived. But such a waiver requires the unanimous consent of the community. I don't know why, I still don't know why where he got the full idea of this unanimous consent of community from. It seems to have been his interpretation of Sefer Batim. What's different from the shul in a home, you can have unanimous consent in a smaller minyan. Such unanimity cannot be demonstrated or assumed on the part of a synagogue congregation. In the case of a minyan in a private home, if anyone objected, he would not pray there with the main congregation, so it could be established. This hinges on the idea that Kvod HaTzibur could be waived, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. And then he says, if done without fanfare, an occasional aliyah by a woman in a private minyan of men held on Shabbat in a home and not in a synagogue, sanctuary, or hall, can perhaps be countenanced or at least overlooked. So he's talking in the language of maybe. He's saying, I wouldn't necessarily make a protest that something terribly usher has gone on. It could perhaps be, there could be room for it. But in practice, Rav Henkin did not go around telling people that they had private minyanim and they could have women read from the Torah. So what we have is this is a really interesting theoretical possibility that there would be some distinction between a fixed shul space and a more private, in particular if it's a one-off type of minyan. But in practice, it's hard to do that much with this. Why? Number one, Sefer Batim is not the Rashba and the Ritva, even though it's an early halachic authority, it's not the most important of them. And he himself just says he presents it as being a unique view among halachis of which he's aware. Rav Yaakov Emden presents this idea specifically in the context of Yoledet, specifically as being in a bidiavad situation. And even then he says that it's contingent on his colleagues agreeing. Rav Ben Sion Abba Shaul also presents the idea in theory. Rav Ovadia Yosef shoots him down, and Rav Henkin as well. He floats it, but he did not put his heft behind it as something that should be done. It remains important. I'm sorry, someone needs to put off their microphone. Someone has their microphone on. Please shut microphones. Thank you. So this is like one of these intriguing things. It might be one of the reasons why partnership minyanim are often called partnership minyanim as opposed to synagogues, not just because they tend not to meet, most of them don't meet every Shabbat, a few do, but most do not. But maybe I think part of the idea is if we conceive of this as a minyan and not as a shul, maybe we can avail ourselves of kind of this aspect of the discussion. Again, what's tricky about this aspect of the discussion is you don't have the voice of a major halachic authority saying, let's run with this. You have it kind of raised as, here's something that possibly gives us some more room. Okay, so what is this business of waiving Kvod HaTzibur? Let's talk about waiving kavod in general. I'll give an example. Parent. You're supposed to show respect and awe to a parent. It's a mitzvah. One of the things, for example, you're supposed to do, your parents come into the room, you're supposed to stand up. Some of us do this. Actually, in the Ethiopian community in Israel, it's unbelievable the extent to which they preserve that level of respect and awe for parents. I think many of us in many of our families, it's certainly true in mine, this isn't what happens. My kids don't jump to attention when I enter the room. I don't jump to attention when my parents enter the room. Am I sinning? So the answer is I'm not sinning, because there's an idea that a parent has the right to be mochel their kavod. A parent has the right to waive, W-A-I-V-E, the honor due to them. There's a sense that if the honor is about something personal to me, then it's something that I have the ability to say that I don't need necessarily in some cases. Now, on the other hand, like a king is not able to waive his kavod. Okay, so there are cases in which kavod can be waived, and there are cases in which kavod can't be waived. And the question becomes, well, what about Kvod HaTzibur, right? If Kvod HaTzibur would be a case where kavod could be waived, and the Hebrew for waiving is limachol, mochel. If mechilat Kvod HaTzibur were a halachic possibility, then in that case, let's say a shul's members all wanted to waive the kvod tzibur, like what Rav Henkin was talking about. Let's say the entire shul got together and say, we hereby officially are mochalim kvod hatzibur. Does that mean that this issue goes away and that women can read from the Torah freely in the shul? The tricky thing about this discussion is that we don't have an early discussion of this about our case. We do have some discussions about waiving kvod tzibur, however, in some of the other cases that we saw. So back to the case of the Chumashim. The Mordechai says that you can, that this reading from Chumashim, again, it's a problem because of kvod tzibur. And then he says, Umashma di machlu tzibur al kvodam shari. And it sounds like to him that this would be a case that if the congregation wanted to waive their kavod, they could. Is that applicable to our case? Well, Rav Chizkiah de Silva, 17th century Italy, 17th century, 18th century, 17th century, I think. 17th century Italy thinks it is. Aval lefi tam kvod tzibur, kol dem machil tzibur al kvodam rishayim. L'dat Rabbeinu Yerucham v'Mordechai. He infers from this statement of the Mordechai that, you know what, when it comes to the rationale of kvod tzibur, whenever the tzibur wants to waive their kavod, rishayim, they can. Okay, he seems to basically say across the board, you can waive kvod tzibur. So if we followed that logic, it would seem that, yeah, it's really up to the community. Of course, things aren't quite that simple. The Shulchan Aruch on this very case of Chumashim says no. He says we can't do it. He does not allow. He discusses in the Beit Yosef whether you could waive it. He says here he does not allow in this case for waiving kvod tzibur. One of the classic discussions about waiving kvod tzibur, in particular in a case where we're talking about public representation of the tzibur, has to do with a youthful shaliach tzibur. Now, when I say shaliach tzibur, I need to be careful here. When we think of shaliach tzibur, often in our shuls, that's someone who switches, a prayer leader who switches every time we have a minyan, right? Someone else might be leading shachris today. Someone else is going to do mincha. Another person's going to be in charge of mariv, and tomorrow it's going to be someone else for shachris. It can be all over the place. In the context of this discussion, we're talking about someone who's set, like a chazan of a community, someone who's going to be leading every prayer, like the official representative of the community. The question is, there's a Gemara that says a community really should have, the chazan should be someone with a full beard. Now, by full beard, it doesn't necessarily literally mean that the beard has to be long. It means a male who has reached full maturity and adulthood, like, not a 13-year-old. Right. So, by the way, I think this makes intuitive sense still today, right? If your shul were looking to hire a full-time prayer leader chazan, my guess is that they would not consider for that position a 15-year-old high schooler. It's my guess, right? Certainly not a 13-year-old. They'd probably be wanting someone who's more adult. So the Rambam does something interesting, and he says that the issue here is one of kvod tzibur. Mi shalonit malaz kano. Someone who has not filled his beard, i.e. has not reached full maturity, even if he's a big Talmid Chacham, he can't be doing things because of kvod tzibur. By the way, this is also interesting in terms of this question of intuitive and embarrassment or whatever. This is someone that there's something about him that actually they would be very proud to present as a prayer leader. But even so, the Rambam says there's a constraint. Now, there's a discussion, there are differences of opinions about, well, does that mean that it can or can't be waived? The Rosh also brings this. He talks about how, well, there's a difference between if it's a fixed prayer leader or a temporary prayer leader. And and the Beit Yosef, without using the term kvod tzibur, and the Beit Yosef basically says that what they're arguing about is whether you can be mochel on kvod tzibur. Let me see if I can get the English in here for you also. Here, I can put it all on the screen. Okay. According to this, Lefi Zeh Rambam, im ratzu tzibur limchol kvodam, nireh she'reshut biyadam. The Beit Yosef somehow infers from the Rambam that there's room for the tzibur to be mochel in the case of the shaliach tzibur without a beard. Aval Rosh katav, but then he infers from the Rosh that they couldn't be. Exactly how he draws these inferences is not completely straightforward. The Beit Yosef presents this as a debate. Meanwhile, the Beit Yosef himself says, The Beit Yosef himself paskins The kvod tzibor, you cannot be mochel kvod tzibor in the case of the shaliach tzibor. Okay, without a beard. So we're left with this tricky situation where we have different perspectives about if you can waive or if you can't waive in other cases. We don't have direct discussion of our case. There's one more opinion here that's really, really important for us to see, and this is the opinion of the Bach. We talked about this briefly last week, and this one is really essential for formulating what's going on here. The Bach has a different take. He's still talking about the case of the Shaliach Tzibor with the beard. He says, L'fiani atati, my humble opinion, you're at the Afla Rambam Rashba, even according to the Rambam and the Rashba, lo mahani mechilat tzibor. He's disagreeing with the Beit Yosef. He says, even if the Rambam, you couldn't be mochel kvod tzibor, de'ein perush mipnei kvod tzibor shu keneged kvodam bifnei bnei adam. The explanation of kvod tzibor is not about the person's feeling of respect. Sheto'il bo mechilat tzibor. That's a case where being mochel would work. So for example, like the cases of rolling the Torah scroll, and the whole community says, no, it's okay. That's about them, perhaps. But this, he says, is something different. In this case, he says, Perusho she'ein ze kvod tzibor, shishlechu lefanav yitaleh mi she'ein lo hadrat panim la'alitz al tzibor. This is not kvod tzibor, that there will be someone representing them in this way. Why? The two, im kain, if you could be mochel, kol hani takanot shetiknu chachamim mipnei kvod tzibor, im ata omer deresha'in li mochol, im kain, all of these enactments of kvod tzibor, if you say they're permitted to waive them, if so, lo ho'ilu b'takanatam klum. It's like you made the takana, the enactment, disappear. D'chod tzibor you mochlim. Everybody's going to be mochel. It's much easier that way. She'ein yecholin limchol al ma she'eino kvod tzibor. Okay, now it seems like what he's talking about. Now, by the way, this is important to note. So the Bach is actually not differentiating between cases. Just like we saw the Pri Chadash seem to say, in every case, kvod tzibor, you can be mochel. The Bach seems to be saying, in every case, kvod tzibor, you can't be mochel. But what's essential about the Bach is he's saying this is not personal. The reason you can't be mochel, he says, a community can't be mochel kvod tzibor in these cases is because it's not about them and how they feel at all. It's about something else. Now, how does that jibe with what we learned? Well, it may be jibed in the sense that if what we're talking about when we're talking about kvod tzibor is this idea of not just how this tzibor appears or reflecting poorly upon them, but it's also this idea about we don't want to foster laxity on the part of the tzibor. We want the tzibor to measure up to a certain level of attention or care with mitzvot, demonstratively so. Okay, then we're talking about something else. And Tiferet Yisrael puts this. He says, "V'nira li dechol kvod tzibor ein ritzon lomar kvod shel hatzibor shera'ui lahem." Seems to me that kvod tzibor isn't about the kavod, the honor that's due personally to the tzibor. Ella, rather, ritzon lomar hakavod shechayavin hatzibor lechabed et Hashem. It's the honor that the tzibor is supposed to have, what they're supposed to be as a representing body before God, shera'ui liyot kara'ui. What they have to do to measure up to being fitting. In other words, this isn't a standard that they're creating. This is a standard that they have to live up to. Nafkamina, and what comes out of this is she'enam yocholim limchol. If we're really talking about the tzibur, if we think about the congregation in this context, or even a minyan as a metaphysical entity, it's the sum is greater, right? And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. All of Am Yisrael is there when you have a minyan there representatively. Then when we're talking about kvod tzibor, maybe we're not talking about how these people feel or who these people are as individuals. We're talking about something that's metaphysical, transcendent, goes beyond time, isn't necessarily responsive to what we think makes sense or doesn't make sense. The Taz takes this perspective of the Bach, and he does say that this is going to depend on the case. He says basically, the Bach's father-in-law, he says basically, there are cases in which we say like the Bach, that the tzibor cannot be mochel on their kavod because it's not about them. It has to do with the tzibor standing before Hashem and how that relationship is being defined by halacha and not by them. And there are other cases in which there is room to be mochel. For example, the cases of tircha, of a burden on the congregation. Well, it's a little tricky for us because we don't know what category our case falls into. We don't know for sure. We don't have a precedent. There is no precedent. There's not a clear precedent in halacha of waiving kvodat tzibur in the case of women reading from the Torah. Rav Henkin, as you saw, thought it was an argument that was worthy of exploring. He thought there could be some possibility, at least in a context, not of like a shul trying to be like other shuls, but perhaps in a context of a private minyan. He wasn't comfortable with the private minyan on its own. He wasn't even comfortable with this, but he thought maybe if the private minyan is, then we could say they're waiving kvodat tzibur because we know they're all of one mind. It's a different thing. But even so, like I said, he didn't say this is practical halacha. And it sort of remains out there. So in some communities, this is being practiced. It remains out there. It's like this really intriguing possibility that doesn't have a clear-cut final resolution because there's no precedent to do it. Generally speaking, if we're talking about changing custom in the shul or changing halachic process in the shul, it's something that we're going to want to have a strong precedent for. We don't undertake change in the shul so lightly. So this is a big deal. The fact that we don't have that, on the one hand, we do have some voices that say, you know, Pri Chadash we saw, across the board it works. It's not impossible that it could work. On the other hand, we have the strong voices, for example, the Bach, saying it can't work at all. And we have these middle voices who are saying, let's distinguish between cases. It's not a trivially simple thing to say. You can understand then why someone like Rav Henkin is saying something like, well, I want to hear what other Rabbanim are going to say, or this requires further discussion. Okay, well, but what about Mr. Feldman, before we started this year, brought up this a case that we're going to see in a moment. And not only a case, what about like in a pressing situation? Like forget about waiving kvodat tzibur. Does kvodat tzibur always work? Is there never any flexibility? So Rav Mas'ud Rokeach says there's never any flexibility. Rabbeinu Rambam Katav Kitzur Adin Disha Lo Tikra Mipnei Kvodat Tzibur Imkein Nesar Lagamri. He says when the Rambam talked about this, he didn't bring the beginning of the Braita that said a woman could theoretically read. This is done. It's over. There's nothing to talk about. A woman can never read. However, there are other perspectives on the matter. The Aruch HaShulchan, for example, compares the case of the woman to the case of the bondsman. We've talked about this before because they share an exemption from positive time-bound mitzvot. And he says, well, you know, if that works, then lechatchila lo ya'aleh mipnei kvodat tzibur. He says both of them are the same in that lechatchila, the proper behavior from the outset is that a bondsman or a woman should not be reading from the Torah, should not count as one of the readers. Now, if he's saying that, then that means that in a pressing situation, which we consider to be like, we have a principle, that a pressing situation is like an after-the-fact situation, or an after-the-fact situation, there might be room for a woman to read. Indeed, Chasdei David, a commentary on the Tosefta, says, if she went up to the Torah, you don't send her back down. B'diavad, it works. Since according to the fundamental law, she could count. Okay? So there is this idea that a woman is not supposed to read from the Torah. But if somehow a woman got called to the Torah, she could read and it would work. It wouldn't be like you'd have to reread the portion. Now, Maaseh Rokeach says no. Maaseh Rokeach says no. This is an absolute, there's nothing to talk about. There's no room for discussion. Done. She gets called up, she reads, you read it over. Didn't count towards your 7. Okay? But the Chasdei David says woman shouldn't be going up to read, but if she did go up, it counts. Or what about a pressing situation where you don't have enough male readers? So for example, this is where the case of the city of Kohanim comes up. Okay, this is the Maram Rottenberg. The Ir Shikula Kohanim. Well, if you have a city and they're all Kohanim, and the problem with Kohanim getting aliyot 3 through 7 is that those are supposed to be for Yisrael. And if a Kohen takes one of those aliyot, he raises questions about his own yichus, whether or not he's really fully a Kohen. Ir Shikula Kohanim, the Ein Ba'afilu Yisrael Echad, like the Al, I think the Al of Jerba, I think they're all Kohanim. Perhaps I don't know. I mean, lahalacha, we don't even say what Maram says. But anyway, you have a community that's all Kohanim. 2 brothers came and they established a Jewish community. Everyone in this community is a Kohen. The women, of course, are not Kohanim. They're Eshet Kohen. It's a little different. Nearly, the Kohen koreh pamayim, v'shuv yikre'u nashim. The Kohen would take the first 2 aliyot, And then women could read, because everyone could fill it out. Okay, given sure, true, we say kvod tzibor, don't do it. That's heicha delo efshar yidche kvod tzibor. Where it's impossible, we push off kvod tzibor. So in a shatat chak, in a pressing situation, we push off kvod tzibor. Some people have cited this as an example of waiving kvod tzibor. That doesn't seem to be what the Maram Rottenberg is saying. He's saying in a pressing situation, shatat chak dieva dami. In a pressing situation, a woman could read. So, for example, you might remember this. We slipped this in when we were looking quickly at what Rav Shafter said in a prior shir. Yeah, let's slip that. Yeah, I mean, if there's no man who can read and a woman can read, if there's no other way you're going to have a Torah reading, a woman can read. B'diavad, a woman can read. If the woman was called to the Torah, Vadia Yosef in an audio shir, says a woman was called, somehow a woman got called up to the Torah. She went up. She reads. After the fact, she can read. That doesn't mean, though, that you're allowed to call her up. You're not supposed to get there. That doesn't mean that you're supposed to get to a point where there's no one who can say that you can read. And this is a really important point. We talked earlier about Rav Sperber treating this halacha as something that's sort of a little more flexible. Maybe, for example, the Rambam about the rationales behind commandments wouldn't apply here. His argument is based on the idea that, well, there is b'diavad and there is shatat chak. There are these pressing situations. There's after the fact where it looks like a woman could read without talking about waiving kvod tzibor. But generally speaking, that's not how we understand things. It's just an example from Minchag Yitzchak talking about the concept of l'chachila and b'diavad. Hadamru chachamim l'chatchila aser, lo machmat sfeika. When you say that something is asur l'chachila, that the proper way to do things is a certain way and the other way is prohibited, that doesn't create a situation of doubt. The halacha is still solid. It means that the way the halacha was built from the get-go is it's not what you're supposed to do. After the fact or in a pressing situation, it could be permitted. It doesn't take away from the force of the halacha. And that's a classic read of this halacha. So it's important to know that that's the halacha b'diavad or b'shatat chak, but that doesn't turn it into a lechatchila. Okay. The other main argument that's been brought about women reading from the Torah nowadays has to do with a concept called kvod habriot, and this is also an argument that was innovated by Rav Sperber. And the idea of kvod habriot is it's really a sense of it's a halachic articulation of human dignity. The Talmud here, for example, we're running low on time, so I'm going to try to go a little quickly to make sure we cover stuff. The Talmud here, for example, talks about a kvod habriot is doche lo taseh sheb'Torah. Kvod habriot, human dignity is so great that can push aside a Torah level prohibition. But then the Talmud continues and says, no, what we really meant by that is a durabanan, not a Torah level prohibition. And that's how we understand the halacha. Halacha is, and Rashi explains this very nicely, back to people being mochel their kavod. Rashi says, this is actually, I think it's a lovely explanation of kvod habriot. Rabbanan achluhu li kraihu. Our sages were mochel. Our sages waived their yikar, their honor. They waived their own honor, lavor al divrehem, to allow us to supersede some matters of rabbinic law. Hecha deika kvod habriot. In a case where there would otherwise be impinging on human dignity. Now, the thing is, what are the examples? So classic examples are things like kigon l'taltel b'shabbat avanim shel beit hakisei v'kinuach, like being able to carry rocks that would otherwise be considered muktzah. Back in the days when they used this to clean up after defecating. They wouldn't make someone whose tzitzit broke and in a place where you're rabbinically not allowed to carry, and now the tzitzit are things he's carrying and they're not kosher tzitzit in part of the garment, they wouldn't say, oh, you have to strip in public. That would be a matter of kvod habriot. And in fact, generally speaking, examples of kvod habriot pushing aside rabbinic level halacha tend to be things that are specifically mentioned in the Talmud, or tend to be things that are actively putting someone in a situation of disgrace. If you can't clean yourself after defecating, that's actively kind of lowering your honor. The question becomes, Rav Sperber's suggestion was that nowadays for women, not being able to be called to or read from the Torah is a matter of kvod habriot. Here's how he puts it. We have here a clash of two principles of different sorts, kvod hatzibur, if such exists, and kvod habriot. We're speaking about a doubtful consideration of kvod hatzibur, for it is entirely possible the congregation has waived its dignity, or that senses no affront at all to its dignity in women being granted an aliyot, right? Again, this is his concept that it's not really a halacha because either the possibility of waiver or because perhaps the relevance is different. At the same time, we know that many women have a sincere desire, a yearning to take an active spiritual role in the life of the community and its pursuits. And excluding them from the synagogue or from involvement in worship ceremonies is a cause of great distress. It thus seems clear that kvod habriot, individual dignity, must overcome kvod hatzibur, particularly when the concept of kvod hatzibur does not really pertain as it might have in ancient and medieval times. I think the reason that this argument for enabling women to read from or be called to the Torah has become so compelling for a lot of people is because it speaks to them in a way that waiving kvod hatzibur doesn't. On a pure halachic level, and we'll come back to this, the argument about waiving kvod hatzibur, why it's by no means, as we've discussed, why it's by no means a sure thing, there seems to be more of a halachic potential halachic opening there to discuss than here if we really think about what the way we've been seeing kvod habriot is being defined, right? We're not talking here about something that's actively disgracing the woman. We're talking about sort of like not doing something positive. It is causing her distress. It's not the kind of example that we're seeing of, the typical example, it's not Talmudic example of blatant physical distress either. It's still very compelling to people though, because even though I think really on a halachic level, it's the weaker argument. I think it's compelling to people because it speaks to them. It's the argument that makes sense, right? Women are experiencing great distress, and what Rav Sperber has done is kind of tried to find a halachic articulation for how we can adjust a halacha in light of a real distress for people. And that's, I think, what makes this argument so compelling. What's difficult is that this is not technically how this is not how this principle is generally employed. It's not only that, Rav Jeremy Weider makes the point very well, and I'll explain in a moment. It is not that in certain limited circumstances, the prohibition of calling a woman to the Torah offends the human dignity of an individual woman. Rather, it is the prohibition itself that is said to engender offense to human dignity. To argue that the principle of kvod habriot should dictate that the prohibition of calling a woman to the Torah be set aside is not to resolve an incidental conflict between two values by choosing one. Rather, it is to entirely abrogate a principle because that principle in its entirety is perceived to conflict with another. This is far from b'dechia, pushing something off, which is usually the basis on which kvod habriot works. There is, to the best of my knowledge, no precedent in halacha for nullifying a halachic principle on the basis of kvod habriot. Effectively, what he's saying, look, who defined kvod hatzibur? Chazal are providing us with it through tradition, through Masoret. Chazal are providing us with the halachic definition of kvod hatzibur. Who provides the halachic parameters of kvod habriot? Chazal. It's basically untenable to suggest that Chazal, who are so sensitive to kvod habriot and set it up, would create an entire halacha that they would consider to be contravening this principle. You'd effectively be wiping a whole halacha off the map on the basis of Chazal. But Chazal are responsible for both halachot. It's really not a simple argument to make at all. And I say that even though I understand how compelling people could find it. The truth is, the thing that could be an interesting argument, which some have also made, but also has not really been it's not been embraced. You could ask, well, back to the idea of shatat chak. Is there a point at which this distress is not really the way that the way that Rav Sperber is talking about the distress that women, some women at least, feel at not receiving an aliyah, which is a real thing for many women. it's not the same as really the halachic category of kvod habriot. It's not. This is a very highly irregular application of the idea of kvod habriot. What he's suggesting. Could you say that we've created this kind of like a gigantic generation-wide shat hadchak? Right? We talked about shat hadchak is not a question mark. In a shat hadchak, this idea of kvod hatzibur does not apply. Can we say that it's just a generation-wide case of a pressing situation? And for that reason, so it's really hard to say something like that also. First of all, because of course, there are many different women with many different perspectives on whether this is an issue or not. Also because generally speaking, we have some cases in halacha where there have been major statements made for women to, let's say, to attend shul in certain cases where a community had a different custom, or to sing in certain cases where the community had a different custom. Generally speaking, that's based on the thing being pushed aside in shat hadchak as having been a custom. The closest analog I can think of is the case of women's Talmud Torah. In the case of women's Talmud Torah, the Mishnah Berurah comes out, and whereas others read it differently, the Mishnah Berurah says this is a case of this is a case of it's time to do for God, and that sometimes that means going against what an easy understanding of halacha would seem to indicate. So that's a case where the Mishnah Berurah at least presents the extent of women Talmud Torah that he endorses as being because of the press situation of the generation in a kind of a global sense, facing off against a halacha. We do not have a Mishnah Berurah right now saying that about women and reading Torah. The case of women learning Torah is also very different because, and this is really another topic, there's a lot of openings there are more openings within the sources, and it also doesn't deal with the custom within the shul. So that's also an avenue that perhaps at some point could be explored. It's pretty hard to say that we're there now in a way that would allow us clearly to act. Just a little quote from Rav Lichtenstein. I don't think we can really read the whole thing, but Rav Lichtenstein was talking about how kvod habriot can sometimes apply, and sometimes it can apply, and sometimes you wish it would apply and it doesn't. And he just points out that in a situation in which the value of kvod habriot does not withstand the conflict against other halachot, there's a compelling need to sharpen the concept's significance for a spiritual, intellectual, and ethical effort to bring this great principle to actualization. Okay, reluctancy is kind of hard to understand in 20 seconds or less. But what I think he's saying is the fact that something doesn't fall in technically into the category of kvod habriot, so that it doesn't push aside another halacha, doesn't mean we should ignore it and pretend that there's no issue. There might not be the halachic response that people want to make, might not be available to us, but that doesn't free us from the responsibility of seeking a halachic response. And in conclusion, we don't have, I'll sum up in a second, I just want to show we don't really have, we don't have anything near a halachic consensus in favor of partnership minyan. It's really the opposite. Even before partnership minyanim came on the scene, to the extent that people were dealing with this, for example, Tzitz Eliezer, this was before partnership minyan were even being imagined. Kavina natam mishum kvod tzibur. Once we've established the rationale of kvod tzibur, soger aleinu haderech uvshum panim eini shaula leminyan shiva likor b'Torah. Once we've got kvod tzibur, the way is shut. There's no way that a woman is going to read from the Torah. We have strong statements by Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz, by Rav Schachter, by a number of halachic authorities, Rav Yaakov Ariel against partnership minyanim. In favor of partnership minyanim, you have a number of shul rabbanim. Rabbi Lokshin, who spoke here earlier, is a halachic advisor for some of these minyanim. You have Rav Sperber, I think, is probably the highest profile and most well regarded of those who've argued for partnership minyanim, but it just has not been embraced among halachic authorities. And what's perhaps unfortunate is that it seems to me, at least, that the stronger argument to build on was the one that Rav Henkin was playing with, having to do with waiving kvod hatzibur in unique contexts. And the weaker argument is the one that Rav Sperber, I think, has been advancing, which is an application of kvod habriot, which is appealing intuitively as it is. I don't think it's not, it doesn't read as well as plausible within the sources. It leaves us a little bit stuck, as it were, in the sense of not everybody, meaning there are a lot of people who are very happy with the status quo. Sometimes it's difficult for me. I think one of the times when it's been most challenging for me, and this is actually something Rav Henkin raised, is Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah, in a lot of shuls, there's a custom for all the men of the congregation to have an aliyah, and sometimes even all the boys of the congregation to have an aliyah. And as a woman who's really feels very connected to Torah, I'd say that's the time of year more than any other time where it can be painful for me a little bit that I can't be called to the Torah. This moment where, wow, that my 10-year-old the 10-year-old son of my neighbor is getting called to the Torah, and I'm not, and that's hard. And I know that, and that's a real complicating thing. It's a real complicating thing. Sometimes, and this sounds terribly ableist, sometimes it's even hard, accommodations can be made for a blind person to read from the Torah, or for someone who has a disability. On the one hand, of course, I want Torah reading be inclusive. It's hard sometimes that and there's halachic basis for this. We didn't look together. There's a Masat Ben Yamin where he talks about how hard it is for him being blind not to read from the Torah, and how much he wants to do it. But then he gives a whole list of halachic reasons why it's legitimate. It's hard that there's an easier halachic case to be made for inclusion in some areas than in others, and so I really understand. I very, very much understand the motivations of those and the desire of those who've started partnership minyanim and who participate in them. The halachic argumentation is not so simple. It's relying on views that have not been widely embraced, and actually have been in many cases on the whole rejected by a lot of the mainstream halachic authorities, and that's not a trivial thing either. It leaves us. So Rav Henkin makes a suggestion that maybe in Simchas Torah Davka, maybe specifically in Simchas Torah, there could be room to have a woman read from the Torah. Why? Because there's so many rules of Torah reading that seem to be a little bit different on Simchas Torah. But you know what? He didn't have a minyan. He didn't run a minyan where women were doing that. At Nishmat, where he was the posek, women were not getting called to the Torah and Simchas Torah. Even when there was a minyan in the community that would be there for Simchas Torah. So it's one of these things where I think Rav Henkin made some of the strongest possible arguments to be pursued, to develop in terms of the possibility of room for this, and the kind of discussion didn't get completed and didn't get picked up, and he himself did not feel that he was in a position to say that this should be done and to the level that he really put it in practice. Though I think, I can't read his mind. I think it's something that he would have been interested in seeing. I think he wanted it to be pursued. He wanted it to be discussed in a different way. And at the same time, it's just this very interesting question about the halachic process as well. So what does it mean when you have a few voices who are making a halachic argument that's not simple, that's challenging custom, and people start practicing along those lines? How does that fit into how we relate to the halachic process as a whole? Sometimes there has been grassroots development within the world of halacha, and that is something that's there. But at the same time, it doesn't make it simple. So I think if there's an overall summary here, and then we'll take questions. I think what we're saying is that I think there's something to talk about. There's more to hash out, but it's I think it's difficult to say I think it's difficult to act on the ideas that have been floated so far with confidence. Though, there's, if someone, for example, if Rav Sperber is someone's personal Rav and Posek, I can understand them following the Rav and Posek, doing so with the knowledge that his position has not been embraced more broadly. And that's kind of where we are. It's not just one of these simple cut and dry things that's done and over. Who knows? Maybe in our lifetime, someone is going to pick this up and develop the ideas in an interesting direction. But there's really no way to know. And it's sort of playing out as we speak. Okay, Rabbi Jay, you want to shoot some questions at me?
Sure, very, very nice, very thoughtful, and addressing issues. I'd like to hear the shir in 15 years, and maybe your conclusion will be very different, which is, I think, what you're saying, and could very well be. I think I mentioned this before. The changes in women learning and women and everything, and women in society, women voting for Jewish, non-Jewish society are so rapid that, to think that in one generation would go from a woman wouldn't know how to open up a Gemara, most women, to women rabbis and women aliyot, really in less than 50 years, that's has happened, is earth-shattering. So, I think those who might be a little, disappointed, if I could use that word, give things time. There's not a final decision, and those who are happy with the way it is, well, beseder, whatever. But I think it will happen in Israel. Ha-Torah. That's where it started, and that's where we have to look to this happening. Rabbi Robinson sort of alluded to that point on the Parsha Shir. Those who were there this past, Thursday night. Anyways, let's get to the question.
Rabbi Kelman, Bli Neder, if you want to invite me in 15 years to revisit the topic.
Of course. Well, who knows what other innovation we'll be having there? Listen.
Maybe we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Please God. Okay. All right. Let's get started. Okay. Kara wants to know, in other areas of halacha, how often do poskim respond to hypothetical situations? If sociologically no woman thought of having aliyah for a century, why would rabbis have considered the issue? Right. It was sort of irrelevant for 1,800 years.
It's a fantastic question. It's one of the reasons why this issue is so difficult, because it wasn't being discussed. So what do you pick up from silence? But it happens very frequently in halachic literature. Halachic literature is not responsive literature tends to be very, very digressive. A lot of tangents, a lot of pursuing a lot of lines of thought. And that there's that joy of learning Torah, of playing out different possibilities, so that you often do have a lot of really theoretical discussions. And then what's great about it is that sometimes those things that were really theoretical, 200 years ago, become practical now. You sort of don't know what's going to be picked up and what's going to be important. But yeah, it happens. It happens all the time. That on the one hand, you're absolutely correct that there's the element of responsa, that is responding to the question the person's asking now. But then there's sort of like this individual motor of Talmud Torah for a lot of halachis that just takes on a life of its own in surprising directions.
Okay, I guess iPad wants to know, there's a way, how do you know one baked in is greater than another? I really think that's a topic we can't really fully address now.
Yeah, that's a biggie.
Yeah, it's a big topic, it's an important topic, but okay, not for now. A Mishnah Bright is not a takana. I'm not exactly sure the relevance of that comment.
Okay, so a halacha that comes out of a Mishnah or Braita that's widely accepted is treated as an enactment or as a.
I would hold even more than an enactment.
That answers the question.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
That answers the question.
Okay, good. Okay, seems from the tour that kavod tzibur does not apply at all to women's tefillah, if not in a synagogue, or perhaps even in a synagogue, not at the same time as men's minyan is taking place. Okay.
Right. So kavod tzibur, that it's actually a really interesting question. This is a whole other question, which is the relationship of a woman to a tzibur. Is when we're looking at the tzibur, are women are members of the tzibur? Can they create the tzibur? How do we define the tzibur? There's it just came up. People who did Daf Yom Mishkalim, it comes up there. It comes up with respect to korbanos, and it's not an easy one either. You can kind of read it. You can read it in different directions. But women's tefillah, the idea of kavod tzibur with women's tefillah, you wouldn't have the formal concept. In terms of Kriyas Torah, we talked about it previously, that women reading the Torah in a women's tefillah, it's not a formal act of Kriyat Torah in any case. So Kvod HaTzibur wouldn't apply there. Though, and this is, interesting, the idea of putting a burden on the community, if we understand Tzibur in a broader way, could sometimes apply in different contexts in a looser sense. So I think formally, I think you're correct. Could there still be some kind of informal cousins to this that could be applicable? Maybe. I mean, it could be interesting to kind of explore.
Okay, Yudi's asking, when did women start benching Gomel in shul? Correct. That didn't happen when I was a kid, but it happens now all the time.
Yeah. So actually, there's I mean, it's right. It's also its own discussion, but there's a Knesset Agdola, which goes back a few hundred years, I think, in Turkey, that already is saying women shouldn't be not making Birkat Gomel in front of a minyan because they think it's a problem of tznius. So it's some of these discussions are older. It varies by the community, but yeah, like what we saw in Rav Yaakov Emden, that sort of the husband going up to the Torah was considered to kind of handle it for the wife. I think was more widely practiced in the past in a lot of places. And look, that's a big part of what's going on here. I think in former generations, if your husband got an aliyah, people said to you, Mazel Tov, the wife, right? Like there was a sense that if he had a kavod, it was your kavod. And I think that's something that's a lot less obvious or intuitive to people now. And of course, not everyone's attached to a husband. So that's, but I think it isn't, I think that's like a real shift, that it happened to me once. My husband had an honor for Simchas Torah, and someone came up to me the next day and said, Mazel Tov on Simchas Torah. I honestly blinked. I didn't know what they were talking about. And it reminded me, your husband, Chasen Torah. Oh, right. Yes, thank you. Bruchati. But I think there was, it's a generational shift. But I think that, that clear sense, and I do still feel it. I did feel honored when he got it. I just didn't feel it was mine. I think in the same way that perhaps my grandmother might have felt that her husband getting an aliyah was hers. Yeah.
Ishto Kagufo, yes, a reworking of Ishto Kagufo. It's Valki Ishto. Yeah. Okay, for sure. Okay. Sibor, pointing out congregation and community. What's if there's a difference? You sort of alluded to that, I believe, right? And
yeah, and it's not so simple. I can't give you a straight answer. I think it's being used in slightly different senses in different places.
Okay. Jude pointed out, I'm not okay. Rav Elazar Ben Azari was 18 when he was appointed the Nasi, but 18 was people got married at 18.
No, but also it's a perfect proof, right? What happened for him to be appointed? His hair turns white.
Right.
Right. But also, the role of being a Nazi is a little different from the role of a Shliach Tzibur. This is also another one of these complicated things that the rules are different in different situations. Not everything is the same. That's part of our.
No, he was a compromise choice. I mean, he was, but he was married already. I mean, it was a whole different story. It was, but he was really the compromise candidate after, they had already rejected Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Akiva, so, okay, he was the last man standing. Happens a lot on
He was a Kohen without a lot.
I'm sorry?
He was a Kohen with 10 generations.
Right, he was a descendant from Ezra, okay, the Gemara says, and he was wealthy, had a lot of money, that never hurts, okay. Does Rabbi Sperber's argument apply if the majority of women do not feel the distress, but rather only those in a particular group?
So I think that's also one of the harder things about the argument. Kvod, I didn't bring it up because we were rushing, but yeah, Kvod HaBriot, the typical cases of Kvod HaBriot are universal. Like pretty universally, someone's going to feel uncomfortable if they can't clean excrement off of themselves. How women are reacting to not being called to or not reading from the Torah is, I think, a very personal thing with a lot of variation. Even within, a like-minded community, I still think there's variation to how women experience that. I gave an example, an anecdote of sometimes having a tough time on Simchat Torah. Generally speaking, it doesn't weigh on me in a heavy way, personally. I don't feel I don't feel actively dishonored by it. Right? It's an opportunity that if halacha afforded me the opportunity, it's one that, I'd probably be excited to take. but it's not something I feel actively dishonored by not being able to do. And Kvodat Tzibur is not necessarily subjective to start with. So it's as I said, I think the stronger tack to take if this is going to be explored further would be developing the idea of Mechilat Kvodat Tzibur, which is still not a smooth path, but I think that's easier. I think using Kvoda Briot here is a tough sell in terms of how it's been understood through the generations.
There is no doubt that many women don't like Simchas Torah at all. Either they don't come to shul, they sit in shul and talk. I mean, I don't have to tell you, that a lot of shuls are starting out Divrei Torah for women and stuff, different thing. Of course, women hakafot, that I guess in our community is no longer a major issue, at least in the modern Orthodox community. It used to be 20 years ago, but now, so I think there are many women who really don't like Simchas Torah for all the reasons you had suggested. Okay, we'll have to see what happens.
Also, I mean, again, and this is what's so tricky. So is not liking it the same thing as having your Kavoda Briot affected? That's
I don't even know if that matters. If the issue is if it makes women not like shul and not like a holiday, it's like you have to tell people not to clean too much before Pesach, because if they clean too much and they hate Pesach, that's a terrible thing. So you have to always balance the other considerations, and there are lots of other things to balance, and that's why in 15 years I think this year will be very, very, very different than it is today, perhaps. Okay, I don't know, I was always wondering if I guess Rabbi Henkin wrote about this, but he never actually advocated or never.
He wasn't talking about, this is an interesting thing. He was talking about the possibility of there being, let's say there were different tables of readers, and there's a minyan at each table. He was kind of floating the possibility that maybe there could be a table with a minyan and also women would be able to read there. He's not talking about there being a woman's reading table, because that's not Keri'at Torah. It's not technically Keri'at Torah if there's not a minyan present. That's Talmud Torah, something different. But like I said, I am not aware of him doing this in practice, so it's hard. That's also I think he was interested in seeing if this could become a possibility. Like if there was going to be, back to hashing it out, if there was going to be a place to see if there was a way to do this Simchas Torah. Ravenkin was very practical when he thought of stuff. Simchas Torah might be a way to kind of check it out, as it were, without and having it sort of contained, like creating an opportunity, but having it be very well defined and having a reason for it being well defined. So I think he was interested in pursuing the discussion, but he didn't pick it up in a very active way, and it didn't get picked up in an active way so much. And again, it's also, so you could say, oh, well, we do so many unusual things in Simchas Torah in terms of Keri'at Torah. That's true. But a lot of those things are longstanding customs, and this isn't. And that's, it's hard. And this is coming from someone, I would love to be able to, to have that as an opportunity. And I'm a student of Rav Henkin, and it's still not clear to me that that's something that I would be comfortable doing, even based on what he said, because I don't think he came out and advocated for it.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. The tension between our personal wants and our fidelity to our tradition, our understanding of our tradition, that's a fascinating thing. A lot of people don't care about the issue, but many people do. So I want to thank you once again for a really fascinating series, and I want to wish everybody Chag Sameach, good day, and we should have peace. Like you say, we can learn Torah. I don't know what may do other things here and there, but let's hope to hear good news, and thank you very much. And
I want to say that I really it's hard to give a shiur like this because that it's not easy. What we're up to, it's not an easy answer. It's not an easy resolution. The hope is, though, that we can learn to discuss. I would like to kind of, and I think here we did it, or at least to some extent, I would like to model a way that we can talk about these issues that's not divisive, that is bringing us together, to connect over Torah and mutual respect. And Bezrat Hashem, that kind of Achdus will work in our favor.
This is the
Based on
best
past
quote
experience.
about this that I've ever heard in my life. From I'm 83 years old, and one of the, so to speak, founders of Jofa, and absolutely terrific.
Thank you.
Listen, I've said many times, Laurie, you've say, I think that's the way you approach these subjects is done with such a sensitivity. And I agree with you. Unfortunately, the Jewish community is not in a place where we discuss this and many other issues in the respect that we should. There's so much polemics, worse than polemics, yelling and screaming and, putting other people who you disagree with down. That's so if this is one step and, whatever, we can agree and disagree in different approaches, and it's all wonderful. And as long as, people are acting in what they think is correct. And even if we have sharp disagreements. So I want to thank you for taking us a step in that direction and really addressing all the sides of the issue and presenting it, and halavai, the community as a whole can learn from this more in this and in so many other areas. And
So
okay.
thank you so much, and Bezrat Hashem, we'll see each other again. If not in the near future, in however many years when we revisit this topic.
No, I'll be 15 years for this particular shir again, but others in the meantime, but
we hope to see you
maybe less than 15 years. Who knows? With the pace of things, maybe 5 years. I don't know. But
with things like this, I'm all for future shirim. Thank you so much.
But anyways, thank you. We'll let you go. Yeah, it's late. The kids were running around. You got to go see how they're doing.
Yeah,
okay.
And almost 9. Shalom Yisrael.
Okay, amen. Okay, thank you. Be well, and everybody be well. And tomorrow morning, this evening, 8 p.m., Dr. Moshe Sokolov, the Ha-Torah of the Week. Tomorrow morning, Shuli Mishkin, 11 a.m., finishing her series. And then Rabbi David Blackman from Australia, will be giving his shir at Friday at 12:30 p.m., which is 8:30. At 12:30 p.m. Friday afternoon, it'll be 8:30 p.m. Thursday night for those on the East Coast. And then Friday morning, 9:30 a.m., which is way past Shabbos in Australia, I'll be giving the Parshat Shavua shir. So everybody's, not Parshat shir, Pirkei Avot, Friday, 9 a.m. And then Sunday morning, Erev Shavuot, Rav Daniel Feldman, and will be giving his last part on halach and human relations, and Rabbi Liebtag will be giving a standalone shir on Simchat Yontif. So we look forward to learning with you and hearing good news, and thank you very much and getting your feedback. And all right, be well, and thank you again, Laurie. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, Laila Tov. Yes.